Alright, let's take a break from drawing and look at some classic comics, or in this case, Little Nemo. We're going to look at Christmas of 1905. Now, in the book we have a couple of Christmas episodes. In the oversized calendar we're going to focus on this episode, which we also have reproduced in the book. In terms of the differences, I've noticed that the color is uniform in this panel, while there is some discoloration here about the reindeer. I'm not sure whether this was because of the printing, or maybe it was it almost looks like a watercolor wash, but I don't think that was being done that back then. There's something similar going on with this panel here, where the color fades. And of course, the reds and the yellows are slightly different. Anyway, let's go ahead and take a look at it. Just like in the previous installments, we have a very busy narrator, and we have dialogue, which doesn't actually add too much to it, but I mean, still a wonderful comic. It's just the way McKay wrote at that time period, and the early generation of comics. So we have an elf. Don't you think that a splendid idea? Are you with me, eh? Maybe the elf is speaking sort of a dialect. It's the only way to get him into Slumberland. Now, Santa actually looks a bit like Morpheus, whom we've met before as the King of Dreams. You'll notice that Santa is partially bald. Now, in 1905, Santa lore, as I think of it, was in a different state than it is today. What we genuinely think of Santa Claus came from the famous poem "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" by, I want to say Clement Moore. Well, anyway, that was a 19th century poem, and that poem combined, obviously, some legends of Saint Nicholas, and maybe a little bit of Odin as the Winter King, and a little bit of the Sami folk. In the 19th century, there were circuses in America where Sami exhibited reindeer and dressed in traditional clothing, which has now become the clothing of elves and Santa. But you'll notice that, but I point out that Santa is bald, and I think that's significant because Santa legends had not quite coalesced to what we have today. Now we have a fairly definite vision of Santa, and back then I think there could have been many different versions. Now, in 1905, I am not sure whether Baum's a book about Santa Claus had been written yet, but nevertheless, I think this time period we do see some things in flux, and we will definitely see something in a few panels. I'll point that out. All right, so let's get back to Nemo. Little Nemo had wished for Santa Claus until his eyes would not stay open. No comma. And he fell asleep. Hardly. Okay, period. So, some of the punctuation is difficult to read. Hardly had he done so when, next panel, he heard the merry jingle of bells. Period. With flushed face and heart beating high, he arose and scampered upstairs to the roof. Third panel. We're going to talk about this in a second. Santa Claus was most surely coming with the speed of an automobile through the air towards Nemo's home. The night was cold, but when Santa pulled up, Nemo was as unconcerned about it as if it was 4th of July. And when Santa told him he might hold the reindeer while Santa went down the chimney, Nemo broke out into a space perspiration. Okay, and Santa says, grab the thing. One thing I want to point out is the phrase, with the speed of an automobile. Now, in 1905, of course, automobiles were still newfangled technology. Now, Nemo does live in the city, maybe what we would now call the suburbs of a city, although back then it would have really been part of the city. So obviously he would have seen automobiles, but it took a generation or so for automobiles to stop being newfangled. We can thank Ford for that. Not too long after this, in the original novel Tarzan in 1912, Tarzan mentions, the narrator describes Tarzan running as if he were shifting the gears of an automobile, and when that was written, that was very slangy talk, very slangy language. So, even a few years later, automobiles were still weird and new, and they kind of would be for a while. Partially through the 20s and 30s. Obviously, it depended where you lived, and all of that. I mean, eventually they became quite commonplace. But keep in mind, this was a very different world. Okay, there is something else I want to point out, but let's save that for a moment. Some of you might already know what I'm about to say. It was quite cute in Santa Claus to encourage Nemo to remain on the roof while he should go below and fill the stockings Nemo had hung. But he is cute, present tense, in all he does, and besides, Nemo cared nothing about his presence now, when he was to do some slight favor for this famous and kind old man. Here is where our story becomes sad, we regret to say. Just as when Santa was disappearing down the chimney. Okay, so Nemo is supposed to look after the reindeer, and this is a time period when children knew how to say, kind of stable a horse, maybe take care of a horse. When the this is I mean, it's something that we don't really have in our culture anymore, where Santa says, "I'm gonna run inside. You just look after the horses for a moment." So he's kind of doing the same thing with the reindeer. Just kind of a little cultural thing I'm trying to point out. Disappearing down the chimney for some reason known only to themselves, the reindeer became scandalously unruly. And he says, "Whoa, whoa. Nemo, as we all know, is no coward. But it is difficult for us to imagine him in any other state of mind, while bounding from roof to roof, than one of extreme fright. However, while we are trembling with fear for him, he is busily engaged getting them under control. A large sack of Christmas gifts, which awaited distribution in the sleigh, was rapidly emptying itself in a manner totally different from what was intended by the old gentleman, who left many miles behind, was at this moment filling Nemo's stockings at home." Okay, so obviously Rudolph doesn't exist yet, and exactly how many reindeer does Santa have? I think he has 6. Sometimes it's hard to tell in each panel. I'm going to say, judging from this panel, we definitely have 6, and then in some panels, a reindeer or 2 is hidden. In the poem, of course, there were 8. But there is one really important thing that I haven't mentioned, and it's not Rudolph. Rudolph, of course, didn't exist yet. We'll come to that in a moment. Okay, while drums, bicycles, toys of every description were being scattered in all directions, Nemo was straining every muscle, endeavoring to save a few pieces of the sleigh. So the sleigh is coming apart and the toys are falling out, which was likewise scattering itself through the neighborhood. As for the reindeer, they were displaying as little regard for anything attached to them as they were to themselves, and flew madly against anything and everything in sight. Nemo knew that sooner or later they must dash themselves to pieces. If he deserted them, if he deserted them, period. So he hung to the reins desperately until he was forced by circumstances beyond his control, oh no, little Nemo, to abandon them. His loud yelling aroused his papa, who came and awoke him in no gentle spirit. And the father says, "Now you see, didn't I tell you not to eat that cheese, eh?" It's a very strange thing to say, but this reminds me of the passage from A Christmas Carol, where when Scrooge sees the apparition of Marley, he says, "Oh, you're just some undigested cheese and beef." I wonder if this was just sort of an old wives' tale at the time about cheese causing strange dreams. Anyway, what is the important thing that I really wanted to point out in this panel? Well, you'll notice that the reindeer are flying, and this is significant for a couple of reasons. One, McKay did not have access to modern film. I mean, there were some silent films at the time. Edison had some. So he had to imagine, what do flying reindeer look like? And you'll see sleigh down, up, down. So there's this undulation. They're sort of fly swimming through the air. Now nowadays this may seem very common because there are many movies where we see the reindeer fly, but McKay had to imagine this. Now I'm sure there were other illustrators who imagined something similar, but I'm just trying to say that they were all having to imagine these things without the benefit of models or claymation or CGI or whatever. But the other thing, and something which I think is a bit more subtle, is the fact that the reindeer are flying. Because if you remember the poem, in the 19th century, the reindeer are on the hill, and then they jump upon the roof, and then Santa does his thing, Santa goes up the chimney again, and then the reindeer jump off the roof, and they sleigh on the ground. So in the original poem, the reindeer do not fly. This is actually very similar to Superman. And in the original comic strips and comic books, Superman did not fly. He bound over buildings in a single bound, just like John Carter of Mars. Superman didn't fly until the 1940s with the Fleischer cartoons because it was easier to animate a man flying than to do other things. Sort of like the transporter in Star Trek, which was invented because shuttlecrafts were difficult and expensive to do. But in 1905, the reindeer are flying. So at some point in the 19th century or early 20th century, reindeer moved from jumping to actually flying through the air. Now, I'm not saying that McKay invented that. I'm sure many authors and illustrators had taken that leap. And, if we go back to the roots of Santa and we look at Odin, Odin, of course, had his magical 8-legged flying horse. So kind of the stories are coming around to themselves that the mysterious Winter King should have the power of flight in some capacity. Anyway, this is a fantastic vision of Christmas, and I'm very happy to share Little Nemo with you all. All right, let's get back to drawing. Goodbye.